for downloading this episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine. Author of The Forgotten Sense, a fascinating book about smell, Jonas Olofsson is an olfactory scientist and a professor of psychology at the University of Stockholm. Our in-depth chat covered everything from retronasal olfaction to amoebas, scent marketing to human pheromones, anosmia to sour herring. Listening to Professor Olofsson will change the way you think about the most primal but least understood of our five senses. Hi, Jonas, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Tim.
You're in your office, I think, aren't you, in Stockholm?
That's right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
At the university where you're based most of the time?
Yes, Stockholm University, Department of Psychology.
Very interesting. Listen, we're mainly going to focus on your book, this amazing book that you've written, The Forgotten Sense. I want to take you back in time to start with, because it's one of the things you say in the book, very interesting. You say that babies sometimes learn to smell in the womb. Now, I don't want to take you that far back in your life. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what your parents did. Were they scientists?
No. Actually, I'm the first one in my family to get a PhD. Actually, my parents were both raised in farms, family farms in the north of Sweden. And they moved into town, the college town that's in that area, Umeå, and that's where I grew up. So it's a small college town, and for me, I kind of discovered in school that this is really something for me. The university is something for me, and I really felt at home there.
And were smells part of your life when you were growing up? Presumably, if you were living in the countryside, I mean, you get more intense smells. Different smells, I could say, really.
Yeah, I remember very vividly visiting my grandparents when they still had their farms going and being in, with the animals, the pigs and the cows and all these like very, very potent smells. And I guess I kind of learned to appreciate them, that these are not bad smells. They're good and natural smells. And I've perhaps carried that with me because it's very much, people talk about good and bad smells and people are easily disgusted. And I want to kind of reappraise that. And I have a more critical approach and a more appreciative approach to smells of all kinds in my book.
Because you talk about smell being an emotional time machine in a way that it obviously takes you back. I mean, a little bit, Proust's Madeleine being the most famous fictional example of it. Do you have one thing? I mean, was it sour herring for anything? I'm going to try pronouncing this in Swedish. Surströmming. How was that? How's my Swedish?
Excellent, actually. The smell of fermented herring doesn't evoke a very vivid childhood memory per se, but it's definitely part of my upbringing in that part of Sweden. And I've only later I realized that this is not normal, that people would eat this kind of food. It's a very like niche thing, and in Stockholm, when there are many stories of people from the north having their surströmming parties, and people call the fire department. They think it's a gas leak or something like that. So it can lead to all kinds of problems out of its appropriate context.
Yeah, I mean, you call yourself an olfactory scientist, but you're obviously much more than that. You're a distinguished professor of psychology at Stockholm University and the director of its sensory cognitive interaction lab. How much of your life is focused on the sense of smell? What does the lab do exactly? Can you tell us?
Yeah, so I feel like we have over the years built a pretty unique kind of team organization where we approach the sense of smell from multiple angles. So we do pretty much like brain research, brain scans, and how the brain is reacted to smells. We use language models, AI, to try to categorize how people talk about smells in online text. So we use these novel technologies for that. And we have very good laboratories here where we do smell testing and smell experiments. So cognitive experiments, like how many odors can you keep in your working memory at the same time, and how is it different from the visual system, and how are the senses different, and how do they complement each other and work together? Those are some of the issues that we are working on. And one particular issue, which we can come back to later, is how the sense of smell declines in old age and dementia. So that has been a really core part of my research for many years.
And that was your PhD was on that, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. Let's come back to that, because I think it's very interesting and alarming in a way that it's an early sign of dementia, isn't it? I want to go right back in time. I mean, Diane Ackerman, I don't know if you've read her excellent book. She's a poet. It's called A Natural History of the Senses. And she writes that our sense of smell is a throwback to that time early in evolution when we thrived in the oceans. We were underwater. And she calls it the first of our senses. And you in the book call it the most primal of our senses. But why did that sense come first, do you think? Why did we start smelling before we started looking and hearing?
Yeah. So chemical communication that's the way that cells communicate, right? They have a cell membrane, and there's like a transmission of chemicals that passes the membrane and interacts with the membrane. So it's like on a very fundamental level, that's the form of communication that's the most kind of basic, right? And this is way before we have the anatomy to differentiate between smells and tastes. So like primitive, simpler organisms, they are swimming around in this, it's in water basically, and they can orient themselves to nutritious, like a gradient of nutritious solutions. There's research already in the 60s to see that amoebas can swim basically towards sucrose, and they do so when you put a drop of sucrose in a petri dish. They swim towards it. So it's really a very very basic mechanism that has developed into us being able to sense chemicals outside of our bodies. And so it's a very early sense.
So these basic needs are food, as you say, sucrose in the case of amoebas, and also as a sort of firewall in a way that you're trying to avoid being poisoned, right? I mean, presumably your sense of smell is saying, "Well, don't touch that," right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the most fundamental function, I think. In some species, they can smell their way to a partner. So reproduction is also communicated a lot in the chemical senses, smells, especially pheromones. But it's debated whether that is a big important issue for humans. But certainly food and avoiding being poisoned, those kinds of things are the fundamental traits of olfaction.
Yeah. I mean, the title of your book is The Forgotten Sense, and Helen Keller, American writer, she called it The Fallen Angel. Just tell us, when and why did it lose its importance? Was it the 17th century? You talk about that in the book, or was it before that?
Yeah. So the scientific revolution, some historians would argue that's when the visual sense became dominant in Western culture. So earlier than that, perhaps people had a more agrarian, like a rural lifestyle and subsistence.
Like your upbringing in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. And with the scientific revolution, that's when vision became sort of culturally hegemonial, right? We used the scientific tools for temperature and for mapping astronomical movements, and that was used for mapping. So it's also like a very visual kind of science. And of course, map making was big in that time, and it led to the conquest of other continents and the colonialization. And all of those things were driven sort of by the power of our eyes. But something that I find interesting is that the reason why there was such a push to go outside of Europe was in large part because we needed spices from elsewhere in the world, right? So from India and Madagascar and Indonesia and that part of the world, Southeast Asia, we needed the spices there because we couldn't grow them in Europe. So in a way, smells and tastes were sort of the driving force behind that. But it led, paradoxically, to devaluation of the chemical senses when visual perceptions became more important.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You write, in the Middle Ages, people using their sense of smell much more to that they could smell diseases. You're talking about not just doctors, but I mean ordinary human beings could say, God, that guy's got the Black Plague or scrofula or something, right?
Right. Yes. So there was a theory called miasma, and similar ideas are still around, I think, in sort of aromatherapy. We can probably get back to that later in the conversation, but in many cultures, there are these notions that smells communicate disease. So if you smell like a bad smell, that can make you sick. And that was the case in Europe in the Middle Ages. And people thought that the plague, the smell of someone with plague, was actually what would make you catch it, right? This was before we knew about viruses and bacteria. And that's why these beak doctors, the plague doctors that had these big beaks, beak masks, they would wear them because they could stuff these beaks with dried flowers, and that would protect them from the plague. So that's a quite fascinating way in which the sense of smell had a huge cultural impact, right? Yeah.
And also, I suppose, as literacy grew and people started reading books, things like that, smells are notoriously difficult to describe. Was that part of the problem? Was that also why people kind of moved away from to something they could describe more accurately?
Yeah, I think so. And it's been there's been a few people writing scientifically about that from a historical point of view. That back in the day, medical doctors would be trained through like apprenticeships where you would be with the patient and the doctor, and the doctors would often smell their patients and to try to diagnose them. That was hard to explain in a textbook. So when this medical education became more formalized and based on written texts and written tests, that kind of went away. Yeah. So because it is really hard to put to put words on what you are smelling.
I mean, I think you say in the book that at one point they were actually tasting people's urine, weren't they, as a way of finding out what was wrong with them? And imagine doing that.
Yeah. That would get a doctor in trouble if we would do that now.
I think it probably would. Tell us a little bit about Paul Broca, Frenchman, right? And his distinction between osmotic and anosmotic animals.
So he was a pioneer in the sciences of the brain. He was an anthropologist, but what he did could be classified as comparative anatomy, I think, in modern vernacular, and neuroscience. So he would compare brains of different species, and he lived at the same time as Darwin, and he knew about Darwin very well, and they were sort of.
So he was writing when, in the 1830s, 40s, that sort of time?
Yes, in the 1830s and in the coming decade. So he was writing up till the 1860s.
Yeah,
and so he was under pressure from like political pressure, because this was kind of controversial at the time to draw similarities between different species, because there was this need to put human beings on a pedestal and emphasize what is different between the human brain and other types of brains. And so he described it in such a way that for humans the sense of smell has retracted, or it's much smaller and less important. Whereas we instead have these big frontal lobes, and that's where we can use language and higher mental capacity and thought, planning in the future, these things that we thought of as being uniquely human. That's in the frontal lobes, and he almost described it as a tug of war between this like primitive sense of smell and then the frontal lobe and the higher thought, and that made sense at the time. But what I'm trying to the message that I have in my book is that perhaps the sense of smell benefits from what's happening in the frontal lobes. It's not just that like brain regions don't really compete so much with each other as they can create synergetic effects. And that's where we get all this multi-sensory olfactory capacity that I think humans are very good at.
I mean, since the mid-19th century and probably earlier, really, the received wisdom has been that human beings don't have sensitive noses. They don't have a developed sense of smell. And other mammals, I mean, dogs obviously famously, but other mammals too have a much more developed sense of smell than we do. But that's not true, is it? As you say in the book.
Yes. Yeah. So going back to Broca, he described these animals, these categories of animals, as in terms of how much are they driven by smells. And of course, a dog is very much oriented towards the smells in their environment, and same with many other mammals, whereas humans maybe not so much, or it seemed to be to a lesser extent. But that became an idea. It sort of transformed into the idea that we are very bad smellers, which is really a different thing, right? So when the research developed to such a degree that we can actually compare what are the sensory thresholds for different odor molecules, turns out that humans have a very high sensitivity to many different odor molecules. So we really have a very nice, very acute sense of smell. So that notion has been overturned.
And when was that exactly? It's comparatively recently, isn't it, that's come about?
Yeah, I think so. If you go back in the literature, it has been noted sort of on a case-by-case basis. Researchers have noted that, wow, the odor molecule in marijuana, for example, we can smell it in an extremely low dose, right?
From a long way away.
And other molecules, we have extraordinary sensitivity. But then the big kind of synthesis that came out was in 2016. And I referred to in the book, I describe the research meeting in 2015 where these results were first published by my colleague. He's a Swedish-German colleague, Matthias Laska, and he made like a systematic overview of all the different molecules that have been tested on humans as well as non-human animals. And then he kind of compared who had the lowest threshold, meaning the highest sensitivity. And he found that humans are really only second to the dog in terms of the sensitivity to a wide variety of molecules.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, I look back at the Ackerman book, and she said that human beings can distinguish between 10,000 different smells. But you say it's way more than that, right? I mean, it's millions, isn't it? Maybe even trillions.
Yeah, it's been argued that humans can differentiate between at least a trillion molecules, at least a trillion odors. Wow. This has sparked some controversy in the field, and the reason is that you can't test people on a trillion smells, right? So you have to have some kind of statistical mathematical model. You test people on some mixtures, and then you can see if you generalize this to the entire olfactory space, then how many would you reasonably be able to differentiate? So that's what Andreas Keller and his colleagues in New York did, and made a big splash also about 10 years ago in a science paper. But it rests on a lot of assumptions. So depending on your assumptions, you can arrive at different conclusions. But I think, and it's more of like my general impression of the results in the field is that many millions of odor qualities we can differentiate, but I don't have any hard data because it's really hard to get these like formal proof. I think we might never get to. So it will all rest.
But it's a lot more than 10,000.
Much
right?
more, yeah. Much more, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you say in the book that the sense of smell not only reflects the chemical world outside us, but also bears witness to our inner world, our feelings and thoughts. Is it unique, that sense, in that smell? In that sense, smell, why is it so personal?
Yeah. Of course, all of our senses can evoke personal memories, emotions, and of course, music is known to do this, and facial expressions evoke emotions in us. We tend to react to emotional displays in different ways. But I think the sense of smell is perhaps unique in that there are, in my opinion, no emotionally neutral odors. All odors have an emotional component. And I think that's because of the wiring of the sense of smell. We have direct connections to emotional centers, hormonal systems in the brain. And that seems to be like the fundamental template of the olfactory system. So you can easily imagine very neutral, like in neutral pictures, for example.
Yeah, or pieces of music.
Yeah, right.
Like the elevator music,
exactly.
right?
But you cannot really imagine a smell that does nothing for you, and the smells move us in some way.
How interesting. I mean, how much does the sense of smell vary from one person to another? I mean, what influences us as well? I mean, I think you talk about hunger and thirst and memories and associations, because we're not all sensitive to the same molecules, are we? We're very different individuals, right?
Yeah, that's right. So hunger is perhaps the most well-studied topic when it comes to sort of our bodily states and how that changes our smell perception. So we react quite differently, especially to food smells when we're hungry compared to when we're thirsty.
We're still amoebas in a way, right? We're swimming towards the glucose, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's in terms of our bodily states that fluctuates over time. But we also have a lot of individual variation, and that's related to the genetics of our olfactory receptor cells that apparently varies to about 30% of the expressed receptors from what I've read in the literature is different. So a large part of the world of smells is not the same for everyone, and that's something to keep in mind, that we are sensitive to different molecules, and that might shape our attitude towards food and wine and what we like and dislike. It's hard to reach a consensus about
I mean,
that.
I find that tasting wine with other wine professionals, and some people are very sensitive to cork taint, which is TCA, and other people can't smell it at all. And they might still be good tasters, but just that one or series of molecules is not something that strikes them as being unpleasant, or just they don't spot it.
Yeah, that's a really good example. And before we had these great biological scientific techniques that led to the discovery of the olfactory receptor gene family, with famously awarded the Nobel Prize to Richard Axel and Linda Buck. But before then, people were kind of stuck with only behavioral methods to try to use these like differences in individual sensitivity to try to create some kind of like a theory of the olfactory system. So there was a researcher called John Amore who studied these so-called specific anosmias. So people who were insensitive to certain molecules, he would try to establish a complete map of these insensitivities, and then try to create a system for what are the basic components of the world of smell, what are the basic dimensions. But this never really panned out, because the sense of smell is so much more complex than people thought at the time. Now we know we have hundreds of different molecules and maybe millions of combinations all in all that we can perceive. So it's so much more complicated than people thought at the time.
I mean, we touched on this at the beginning of the conversation, but you call the sense of smell cooperative, don't you? How does it take these cues from other senses? How does it work with the other senses?
Yeah, so one perspective that I think is underestimated in the literature is that of predictive coding. So that has been a booming research topic, mostly in the visual field, that the brain is proactive. We're always trying to anticipate what's going to happen next. And if we're able to do that, we will be more effective in interacting with the world, and we will save energy. Right, the brain will save energy because it already knows what's going to happen, and obviously, when unexpected things happen, we are less able. Takes us more effort and more time to deal with it. So, what I think is happening is that the sense of smell collects these clues from other senses, and most of the time, we are in an environment where we can more or less anticipate what it's going to smell like, and when it does smell about the same as our minds and brains thought, then we don't really think about the smell very much. But when we are surprised, when we walk into someone's apartment, for example, for the first time, and there's a very distinct smell there, we kind of freeze and think about the smell for a little bit and try to understand what is it that's smelling. So this, I think, is is a pretty important part of smelling, that we take these clues from the other senses and try to make a prediction. And what we see in our data, me and my current PhD student, Stephen Peshailo, is that the sense of smell seems to be more dependent on these predictions from other senses than other senses are. So if you are surprised with what you see, it doesn't take you very long to adapt to that. But if you're surprised by what you're smelling, that comes at a much greater cost. So that's an indication that the sense of smell is really dependent on those types of clues.
For confirmation, in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, you also write about the role of expectation, and I think that's very important with wine. That, you know, if somebody gives you a bottle of, you know, a Grand Cru Burgundy, you sort of expect it's going to smell a certain way. I mean, does that almost influence the way you smell it?
I think so, and you obviously know much more about wine than I do, but the wine smelling and wine tasting doesn't start with you having the wine in your mouth, right? You can, you have you bring a lot of knowledge. That's what differentiates maybe the expert from the novice. You bring a lot of experience and knowledge from the first time you see the wine in the glass, you twirl it around, and then you smell it, and you already have an idea of what you might expect. So you're searching from different clues, right? Tell me if I'm wrong.
No, it's absolutely right.
And that's I think why people who don't understand and don't appreciate wine expertise, they think, their sense of smell can't possibly be this good that they can pick out all these notes. But I think it's possible, but it requires knowledge, right?
Yeah, I think you're applying past experience, really, aren't you? Yeah. I mean, as we know, flavor is part taste, but mostly smell. And when we taste, we're using our noses. And I think humans are unique in this respect, aren't they? Having this, what you call a back door to the brain.
Right. There used to be this idea that humans are the only people who that can perceive smells through the mouth and the throat. And now there's actually research showing that other mammals can do it as well. How much it impacts them, we don't know. Probably
because we can't ask them.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But humans are definitely, that's one, arguably the most important part of smelling is what happens when we have food in our mouth, all the aromas and the flavors that we can differentiate. So there was one neuroscientist who passed away a few years ago, Gordon Shepherd, who made this case that the human anatomy is uniquely built to facilitate this retronasal smell. And that's a kind of smell that we typically attribute to taste. We call it a taste or a flavor, but it's really smelling.
Yeah, you're not tasting a strawberry, you're smelling a strawberry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I like what you call it. You say that the sense of smell is working in disguise.
Yeah,
right?
It does, and so it's so well disguised that we attribute its magic to other senses.
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting. You said that there's no such thing as an emotionally neutral aroma. What makes a smell pleasant or unpleasant? Or, is it familiarity as well? Unfamiliarity?
Yeah.
Just tell us. I mean, you talk about it in the book, don't you, with durian fruit and obviously, the herring that I mispronounced at the start of the podcast. Just tell us a little bit about culture and what makes something pleasant and unpleasant.
Yeah, that's a big topic. And it's still debated to what extent these preferences are universal and to what extent they are individual, learned or genetically based, right? Yeah. And I am of the opinion that we learn to appreciate smells, and through exposure, familiarity, that is a very important driver of acceptance and liking when it comes to smells. And that's why you see with young children, they tend to be very restrictive with food, but the more you expose them to the smells and the flavors of the food, the more they are accepting of it. So if you have a child and you're able to make them taste it and smell it 15 times, then they usually get over this neophobia, as it's called. We are afraid of the new smells, and that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. It could be dangerous if you haven't tasted it before. But what these cross-cultural studies show is that which smells that we like, there seems to be a lot of cultural similarity across very different cultures. The same people, the same smells are liked anywhere you go. But then you have people in each country that have a completely different mapping. So there's a minority of people who like, fermented food maybe, and you have them in Sweden, you have them in Japan or in Korea, everywhere you go. But it's only going to be a minority, and that might be genetic, right? Yeah. So it's really a combination of the individual genetics and then cultural familiarity.
I think you write in the book about somebody who was a farmer and smelt of manure, and in one particular society that was considered a really good thing, because if you were a farmer, you had land, therefore that made you a bit of a catch. Assuming the farmer was male and a woman was smelling this guy who turned up smelling of pigs or horse shit or something, was suddenly attractive.
Exactly. So that can be definitely culturally attach different types of values, and I think the research on smell, it's very dominated by neuroscientists, and I think and that's good for many reasons, but one of the downsides is that these types of cultural and psychological aspects might not be at the forefront of the research, because if most of the research is on fruit flies or mice, you're not gonna pay so much attention to these cultural differences.
Yeah. Just tell us a little bit about your views on aromatherapy and also on human pheromones, because you come across in the book as being a little skeptical about both of them, really. I'm not introducing your views.
Yeah, for sure. So we can start with pheromones. That the notion comes from insect work, and in insects you can control their behavior to a certain extent by certain molecules, and that research kind of kicked off in the 1950s, and it's been assumed that similar mechanisms would be true for humans. But in my view, it has been very hard to show convincingly that human behavior is profoundly affected by these types of communication, chemical communication. It's, of course, we are receptive to so-called chemosignals and signals from other person's body odors. Most of it is when someone smells strongly, it's a bad thing, right? We avoid them. The discussion about pheromones is more towards like mating and attraction, and whether there are certain molecules that will facilitate those types of behavioral processes. I'm not sure, and I think it's been definitely, there's a lot of myth making around that in popular culture. I don't think the science really backs that up.
And aromatherapy, same thing.
Yeah, with aromatherapy, I think that, and I was on a different podcast with an aromatherapist, and I thought that we would disagree much more than we actually ended up doing, because my view is that the problem with aromatherapy is that it assumes that a particular odor will have the same psychological effect on everyone. But that's not really how it works. Certain smells can have some effects in one person, but other effects in a different person. And it depends so much on our individual expectations, our familiarity with the odor. And to my surprise, she agreed. She was a kind of an active aromatherapist. And she said, you can't assume that lavender will make everyone relaxed. Some people do not find it relaxing at all. But there are other smells that kind of trigger those types of welcome responses. And so it's very individual. And I think people who are active in this field, they also recognize that because there's no real magic in the molecule. The magic happens in our minds. And that's driven by our experiences and our psychology.
Yeah, because you write about scent marketing, don't you? And you say that people it's actually surprisingly difficult to manipulate people with smells because for the reason you've just given. I mean, people always say in England, if you're selling a house, make sure your house smells of coffee or freshly baked bread. Is that rubbish as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good example because, of course, it puts people in a good mood. Most people anyway. So in that sense, it's a good. It's probably a good strategy. But if I would be, investigating a house and there was they would bake bread right before I came, I would be curious to see what is it that they're trying to do here? What's the smell that they're trying to mask with this bread smell? So the context, for me, that would be a bad thing if I was buying a house. So again, the context really, determines if this is a good or a bad strategy. How it will be received depends so much on the individual, so much on the context.
So it might not work because people have probably heard about it in advance, as you say.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Tell us a little bit about something you call nasal gymnastics. That's basically how do we develop our noses?
So this work was pioneered by a German scientist, Thomas Hummel, who is a well-known olfactory researcher. And in about 15 years ago, he published the first paper on smell training for people with smell loss. And most people who come to the clinic and see a doctor because they lost their sense of smell, they lost it from a virus infection. Now, of course, COVID, everyone knows that you can lose your sense of smell from a virus infection, but this happened to many people long before COVID. So post-viral smell loss has been a thing for a long time. So either post-viral smell loss or people who hit their head. Usually they hit the back of their head in a traffic accident or happened to a relative of mine who was a construction worker and fell and hit his head and he lost his sense of smell in this way. So the idea is that through exposing yourself to smells in a more like physiotherapy style manner, you can actually rehabilitate the sense of smell. And this has been, there's now quite a few studies done on that, and they show promising results. Particularly when it comes to post-viral loss. So COVID patients, if they start smell training quite soon after they lose their sense of smell, the smell training will boost their recovery. That's what we think.
Yeah, and what about if we haven't lost our sense of smell? We've already got a sense of smell. We can get better at it by using these gymnastics as well, can't we?
So what we're doing in my team is to develop new types of smell training exercises. And depending on what your particular goal is, there might be like a smell training program that works for you. And I think that like wine tasting courses and these types of connoisseur type expertise training, that's one way of training your sense of smell, because training your sense of smell is not just about the nose, it's about knowledge and how you apply it to what you are smelling. So there are many different types of smell training depending on the goal that you have. For me, as a researcher, one of the most important things that I do is to try to train people's sense of smell as a way of protecting the brain from cognitive decline in old age. So that's a project that we are doing right now.
And that was very interesting, and that's what your PhD was on, wasn't it? This sort of dementia and smell loss.
That's right. And so we have found, and others also have found, that the sense of smell is a sort of a canary in the coal mine for cognitive loss, especially like the Alzheimer's dementia type of cognitive decline that accompanied by memory loss usually, and memory systems and the smell network in the brain, they are quite intimately linked to each other, and that's why the pathology tends to hit both of these systems at the same time. So if you have both memory problems and smell impairment, that's a bad sign. If you're older.
So keep your brain active is what you're saying to people as you get older.
That's what we're trying to explore now, because there's one thing to say that tend to lose your memory and your smell together. But can you train your memory and can you train your smell? Can you do that together? And what are the long-term effects of that? So we still don't know, but that's an active line of research right now.
I want to talk a little bit about gender, because it's often said in wine tasting circles that women are more sensitive tasters and therefore smellers than men. I mean, does the science support that?
Yes and no. I think people tend to overestimate how much better women are in everything that has to do with smell. And I think that has to do with the fact that women tend to say that they tend to value smells more. They have more, like in cosmetics and fragrances that they use in different products. They are more aware, and they're also pay much more attention to how a potential partner, how well do they smell. So these things tend to be more highly valued in women. They also have on average, I should say, I have to watch my words here to not generalize too much, but they tend to have a better verbal capacity than men do. So putting words on what they are smelling, that's something that women do better than men. But if you look at the more sensory capacity, the very basic kind of how faint of a molecule can you detect, there is no difference. So it's more on the cognitive side when it's verbally mediated, and when memorizing, remembering smells, those more kind of higher level things. That's when women are a little bit better.
I want to finish, to come back to the COVID, to the coronavirus pandemic. And you give a figure in the book. You said something like 300 million people suffered from impaired or a distorted sense of smell. And some, have never recovered. I mean, it's very interesting that you cite a study from 2012 of 7,000 young adults, and half of them said they'd rather keep their cell phone than their sense of smell. Did that change with the pandemic? Did people suddenly think, I really don't want to lose this? This is not just a primal smell, but a sense rather, but a vital sense.
Yeah, there was a study came out during the pandemic by Rachel Hertz and her colleagues that showed that the number of people who would rather keep their phone instead of their sense of smell, that had sharply declined. But then now there is also other studies that show that maybe this was a temporary bump. So maybe now we're starting to forget about the sense of smell again, and it's important. So I think there was some change during the pandemic, and that's going to be long lasting. But how big was that change just in people's minds and in their priorities? How big of a change that was, I think, is remains to be seen. I hope we will appreciate the sense of smell more moving forward, but that remains to be seen.
Well, I do too, because as you say in the book, we live in the age of sight, but we also live in the world of smells. And your book is absolutely brilliant. If you want to buy the book, and I recommend it very strongly, I've read it twice. It's called The Forgotten Sense. And who's the publisher in the UK? Was it HarperCollins?
HarperCollins, and William Collins is related to the HarperCollins publishing house.
To the Collins is together, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Jonas, thank you. It's been amazing. What a fascinating conversation, largely because you know what you're talking about. It's been great. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and I hope to see you in London or maybe in Stockholm if I'm over there, tasting some Swedish wine.
Yes, absolutely. You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that was fascinating. I enjoyed the book, and I enjoyed listening to Jonas even more. Hope you did too. Next week on Cork Talk, my guest is Chris Carpenter from Cardinali Estate in the Napa Valley. Join me then. Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @TimAtkin and on Instagram @TimAtkinMW. See you next week.